Back-to-back Western Conference Finals appearances for the Timberwolves is super impressive, but now it leads us to an offseason of potential change. That might seem strange for a team that has been so successful the last two seasons, but we already saw this last year. The Timberwolves are not afraid to shake things up around Anthony Edwards, and what they do this offseason is going to be really interesting. Obviously, last year we know that they made a bunch of big moves. They traded away Karl-Anthony Towns in exchange for Julius Randle, Dante DiVincenzo, and a pick, and they traded up to 8th overall in that draft to take Rob Dillingham, which I think a lot of people have forgotten about. So even after another Western Conference Finals appearance, it's not out of the question that we see big changes this offseason as well. So what are they able to do? What's actually possible for Minnesota? Well, first things first, the first big decision of the offseason is Julius Randle. He has a player option for a little bit over $30 million next season, and whether or not he declines or picks up that option determines a lot about what Minnesota is capable of doing this offseason. One of the big wrinkles for this offseason that you're going to hear about a lot is that there are not a lot of teams with significant cap space. It's basically Brooklyn and a couple of other teams that could get some cap space, but there's not a lot of free agency spending out there available, which could lead to Julius Randle possibly opt into this player option, which might seem a little bit surprising given the fact that he is at least a starting caliber player and the contract values around the league continue to go up. Generally speaking, he's probably a little bit underpaid, although his postseason performance was certainly up and down, and I could see him doing literally anything. I could see him opting in and then playing for 2026 free agency when maybe there's more money out there. I could see him declining and then coming back on like a 3-year, $110 million deal that's a slight raise, but then also gives him more long-term flexibility. But the Timberwolves offseason begins with the Julius Randle player option decision. If he opts in, it opens up a lot of interesting things in terms of what Minnesota can do this offseason. It's much easier to trade him or use him in a potential move or use his salary in a potential move if he opts in, rather than trying to use him in a sign and trade. Now, there are other free agents to pay attention here, though. Naz Reid also has a player option for right around $15 million. I would definitely expect him to decline that number. And you've got Nickeil Alexander-Walker, who's a key rotation piece for them that is also a free agent. Those are the three big decisions that Minnesota has to make, and all of those decisions revolve around another big goal for the Timberwolves this offseason. That is to stay underneath the second apron. This second apron thing is a big thing around the NBA right now as they continue to change the rules around payroll structures, but essentially they want to stay under the $207 million second apron for this upcoming season. If Randle and Reid both opted in, they'd be at $192 million for next year, and that's without bringing back Nickeil Alexander-Walker. Now, they do have some team options they could decline. They could maybe get a little bit of wiggle room around that number. But again, that's accounting for Reid and Randle opting in, and I don't think there's any chance that Reid is going to opt in. And you have to account for some rookies you're going to be bringing in as well because they have the 17th pick in the draft. They might have some second-round guys as well. They're going to add a little bit to the payroll. So essentially, the goal could be, how can we bring back the same team and then also stay under the second apron? Because whatever you may think about Randle and how he maybe was a temporary solution after trading away Karl-Anthony Towns, he was good for them once he got healthy towards the end of the year, and they did just make the conference final. So it's not like they're necessarily under a ton of pressure to change things around. So could they actually bring back all three of these guys and stay under $207 million? Personally, that feels unlikely because if you're working with, let's say that Randle opts in, that's the cleanest option, right? Let's say that Randle opts in. Well, then you need to basically turn $15 million in surplus, difference between 192 and 207, into bringing back Nickeil Alexander-Walker and giving Naz Reid a raise after he opts out of his player option, which makes me think you're going to have to make a decision on some of these guys. Alexander-Walker, I don't think necessarily is going to get a ton of money in free agency, but I would expect it to be at least $10 million a year because he's a good rotation player. And Reid, I could see making $20 to $25 million a year. So again, that just doesn't really account for what you need. If you're thinking about 10 plus for Alexander-Walker and a $10+ million raise for Naz Reid, all of a sudden you're over the second apron, which is just not where the Timberwolves want to be. The whole point of the Karl-Anthony Towns trade was to maintain financial flexibility, to stay away from that second apron for now, and they're right up to it. And so if they need to lose a rotation player, if they need to lose Nickeil Alexander-Walker, if they need to let Julius Randle walk in free agency, I think they'll do it to stay under that $207 million number and try and stay flexible moving forward into the future. Now, all of that might seem like boring salary cap stuff, but it's the point of the Karl-Anthony Towns trade. It is a organization organizational decision and philosophy that they decided on last offseason when they made the Towns trade. Barring a trade, the core of Anthony Edwards, McDaniels, and Gobert is going to be locked in for at least 2 more seasons in Minnesota. That's the good news. Gobert is a $38 million player option in the summer of 2027, and the other 2 guys are signed for longer than that. So that's the core that they're building around, which is why we're talking about Randle and Reed and Alexander Walker as potentially expendable, whether it be in a trade or potentially letting those guys walk in free agency. And although this might seem wildly complicated, not only does Minnesota have a lot of options depending on the Randle situation, but I also really like where they're at. I think the Cat trade has been justified. I think it absolutely was the right move for them. They have the flexibility that they wanted, and they've got a roster that makes sense around Anthony Edwards in the second apron era. You've got McDaniels as a really nice role player that can continue to improve. Gobert's overpaid, but it's not like a crazy number at this point because he still can anchor your defense. You can add a rookie at 17, which is a pick they got in the Cat trade, and you've got Rob Dillingham, Terrence Shannon, and other guys you're waiting to develop on cheap deals at the end of the roster. If they can find a way to keep Nickeil Alexander-Walker and either Reed or Randle, or maybe sign and trade Randle, I still think they're good enough to compete with an uptick in development and shooting throughout the rest of the roster. And obviously a big part of that is someone like Rob Dillingham, Terrence Shannon, those guys continuing to improve, with Dillingham being the big upside piece that they added last offseason. Having said all those things, the thing that people are going to discuss with Minnesota this offseason is big trades. How can they make a move? How can they get a star alongside Anthony Edwards now that they've moved on from Karl-Anthony Towns? Is there a guy out there they'd like to add? Well, Kevin Durant, I know we talk about Kevin Durant in like every other video, but Durant has been linked to Minnesota in the past. There were conversations about them potentially trying to add him at the trade deadline. The only real path you have towards bringing in Kevin Durant is if Julius Randle opts in, and I don't think Julius Randle is going to opt in if he knows he's just going to get traded to Phoenix. But let's just say theoretically, Julius Randle opts in. You can trade him, a couple of other salaries, some picks to Phoenix, and you can keep your core of McDaniels, obviously Edwards, and Gobert, because nobody's really going to want Gobert in a trade, certainly not Phoenix. And then you add Kevin Durant alongside McDaniels, Edwards, Gobert. Maybe you're able to keep Alexander Walker. And then all of a sudden, you're looking at a team that has 2 stars at the center of it, maybe has a little bit more offensive upside with someone like Durant in place of Randle. And that's your big Timberwolves move this offseason. And in comparison to having Karl-Anthony Towns on the team, Durant only has 1 year left on his deal. And depending on what your extension is, maybe it can be a bit more of a financially flexible situation than what you had with Karl-Anthony Towns when he was making like $65+ million for years and years and years. But that only works if Julius Randle opts into his player option, which again, if he kind of thinks they're going to trade him, I don't know that he would opt in unless there's just absolutely no market for him in free agency. The lack of free agency spending really makes this offseason interesting for Minnesota, and frankly is an advantage for them when it comes to working out an extension for Reed, bringing back Nickeil Alexander-Walker, a potential extension for Julius Randle. There's not really a team that they can threaten Minnesota with possibility of getting some gigantic deal in free agency, so that certainly could be an advantage for Minnesota. But if Randle doesn't opt in, it's just going to be really difficult to add someone like Durant or anybody really on that salary structure, because then you have to sign and trade Randle. The sign and trade rules are really restrictive, especially when you're dealing with a second apron team the way that the Suns are, and it gets very complicated very quickly. You're not trading McDaniels for Durant. Nobody wants Gobert and his money. There's really only one way to make it work, and it's if Randle opts in. But you never really know with Minnesota. They have shown a willingness to make big moves and surprising moves every single offseason pretty much that Tim Connolly has been there. I mean, even just going back to the Dillingham and the Cat offseason, but it's not the only time they've been able to or been willing to make moves like that happen. And it's certainly not something that anybody expected last offseason when they traded away Karl-Anthony Towns, so maybe they have a trick up their sleeve. Right now, my best guess for what's going to happen with Minnesota this offseason is this. Naz Reid and Nickeil Alexander-Walker are going to get new deals, but deals that do not take Minnesota even close to the $207 million second apron number, because I think they would let Julius Randle walk before they got close to that number. I would guess Randle would walk and potentially go somewhere else, and or just opt in, and then maybe they can find enough room under the second apron by declining team options and such, and keeping Reed and Nickeil Alexander-Walker. They stay well under the second apron. I can almost guarantee you that that is what Minnesota will do. They will stay under that second apron. They'll take a big with the 17th overall pick, especially if they let Julius Randle walk. Then they're going to develop their young guys, and then in the 2026 offseason, they have a little bit more room to make some moves depending on the extensions they give out this offseason. You've got Dante DiVincenzo, who will be expiring by then. Rudy Gobert will have just a $1 1+1 left on his deal. Mike Conley will be a free agent, assuming he's still on the team. Then you can really truly have the flexibility you were looking for when you traded for Karl-Anthony Towns, or you traded away, Karl-Anthony Towns last offseason. And this situation that they're in, this offseason and the following, is why they traded Karl-Anthony Towns. They still were able to get to the Western Conference Finals. They're more financially flexible moving forward. They got an extra pick in this draft, although they don't have their own pick. It's easier to continue to build up a contender around Anthony Edwards over the next few seasons. They stay under the second apron, and as difficult as it is to be sustainable in this era with the second apron, the payroll restrictions, that's exactly what Minnesota is trying to do and succeeding at for the next couple of seasons in terms of their payroll and in terms of their assets around Anthony Edwards. Rather than being in a situation where they are stuck with Karl-Anthony Towns and don't really have any other options, they were able to get out of it, still have a successful season, and have a bunch of really interesting options this offseason. It might not be the big star move, it might not be Kevin Durant on the Timberwolves, but there's definitely more options than they would have had otherwise, and that, frankly, is just really, really good work by the front office in Minnesota.